Thank you so much for joining us today, Mike.
Oh, it's a real pleasure, Lynn Marie.
I was introduced to Mike via Joe Moore of Psychedelics Today, who has been very kind to connect me with many people in the psychedelic space. And I was telling him I was looking for an authority on the history of mescaline, and he said, you have to talk to Mike J. So I am very excited for our conversation today. I just mentioned in the bio the book that you have written about this. So I would love to start by diving into the difference between some of the mescaline related terms we may have heard, like mescaline versus Huachuma and San Pedro and Peyote. And if we could start there.
That's great. I mean, there's a lot of confusion going all the way back. There's this term mescal that still gets used. You know, when Aldous Huxley writes Doors of Perception, he talks about mescal. Now, mescal also, as we know, is like a spirit made from agave, and it was a kind of alternative term that was floating around the same time as peyote. So the terminology is difficult but interesting to unpick. So let's do them one at a time.
All right, let's start with mescaline.
Okay, mescaline, that goes back to that moment when the word mescal was used by the first Western scientists and experimenters for peyote. And it goes back to 1897 and to a German chemist called Arthur Hefter, who was the first person to isolate it from the cactus. This was difficult to do because particularly with the chemistry at that time, if you start looking at the peyote and pulling it apart and fractionating it and pulling out all the different resins and the different alkaloids, there's an enormous amount of stuff in there. There's like about 50 different alkaloids. And Hefter zeroed down on half a dozen of them, and he gave them names that related to cactus terms. So one he called peyotine, for example, and one he called mescaline because, that was another term that was current. And he tried them all on himself, and he figured out which one it was that produced the visual hallucinations, and that turned out to be the one that he had named mescaline.
Wow. So is that what the Hefter Institute, I believe I've heard this story, but is that the scientist that the Hefter Institute was named after?
Yes, the Hefter Institute take their name from Arthur Hefter. In fact, Arthur Hefter, it was very common for scientists, doctors, researchers at that time to take drugs themselves, particularly if these were drugs that produced a subjective mental effect. How else were you going to do it? So all those kind of great early accounts that we have of peyote from the 1890s are all very full-on first person, what we would now call trip reports, written by people who are often doctors, but who are also often poets and writers, people who are very, very good at medical description. So these are kind of beautiful pieces of psychedelic literature. There was a competition between Arthur Hefter and another chemist, a much more distinguished chemist called Louis Levin, to isolate, this active vision-producing chemical. And Louis Levin was actually very unusual at the time that he didn't self-experiment. He had done a lot of his early work with kind of the first sort of injecting morphine addicts in the 1870s. And he said, I've seen too many people just start off by taking a drug out of curiosity and become addicts. I'm going nowhere near them. So he, of course, was doing the same as Hefter, but he was making all these different, tinctures and preparations, and he was feeding them to dogs and trying to figure out which dog was tripping. So he was never going to win it. So, Arthur Hefter, by taking it himself, won the race. So that's why he's kind of the patron saint of self-experimenting chemists.
I love it. I love it. Thank you for that. I'm trying to picture what it's like to give it to a dog and be like, "Are you tripping, puppy?"
Yeah.
Like that's an interesting technique. All right, let's go into the next one. San Pedro.
Okay, San Pedro is a term that's used for a family of cacti that grow all up and down the Andes very profusely, very fast, between 2,000 and 3,000 meters in the Andes, all the way from Ecuador, down through Peru, down through Bolivia to Chile. San Pedro, as you may have noticed, is a kind of Christian saint's name, so it's not an indigenous name, nor is it a, sort of botanical taxonomy. The indigenous name was Huachuma or Achuma, depending, whether you're talking Quechua or Aymara. And San Pedro, it was kind of, a lot of these indigenous plants were given Christian identities, partly to conceal them from the, Spanish and the sort of, the European colonizers, but also because Christianity had magic, right? So, you wanted to be under the protection of the Virgin or the saints. So that's San Pedro. And San Pedro is, is not a botanical term. It probably covers, depending on how many species you count, this is all very contested. There's kind of, there are two species, the Echinopsis peruvianus and the Echinopsis pachanoi. I've traveled up and down the Andes, and my experience is that you have these deep valleys, and the San Pedros or Huachumas in each valley are pretty different from one another. And who's to say if they're a separate species or if they've just hybridized or subspeciated? And then you'll find other, cactologists who use Cuscoensis and, lots of other sort of species names. So actually, even though San Pedro is very vague, it's quite useful for its vagueness.
Gotcha. Okay. And then in that description, you covered Huachuma, which is essentially the same as San Pedro, just the indigenous name for the same plant.
That's right. And it was not used very widely until recently. I've started to notice in the psychedelic community, more people are using the term Huachuma, which I think is a righteous thing. That's good.
Yeah. And then let's round it out with peyote.
Okay, peyote is the other cactus or family of cactus that contains mescaline. What is so weird about this is that, well, it's kind of very weird in the first place that mescaline should only occur in nature in cacti. What's that about? Who knows? Nobody knows. It's also Huachuma, let's call it, and peyote are about as different from each other as it's possible for a cacti to be. The San Pedro, the Huachuma, is really tall and spiny and fast growing and very conspicuous. The peyote is this kind of tiny little sort of thing that lives in the desert, little kind of dusty little buttons almost. People used to mistake them for mushrooms. And there are various species of peyote. Some contain, there's one in particular, which is Lophophora williamsii, which is the one that contains a good dose of mescaline. But there are other ones that contain less mescaline and a kind of slightly different mix of alkaloids.
Gotcha. And how, you told us how mescaline was isolated, but how did they find out that it was the same compound in both of these cacti?
Well, it was not identified in Huachuma until the 1950s or 1960s. So you have some early accounts from Spanish, Jesuits, who are usually the people paying attention. And they said, well, the natives use this cactus, to see visions and for healing, and it may be good against fevers and whatever else. But it was only in the 1950s and 1960s that ethnographers, anthropologists, particularly in Peru, looked at these coastal cities where there was a kind of particular culture of curanderos, folk healers who worked with Huachuma, and they went, it looks as if there's something kind of mind-altering or psychedelic in here. And so mescaline was only identified, way, more recently as containing mescaline.
Okay. Now, if we could go back and if you could talk a little bit about as far back as we know, the roots of the uses of each of those plants, those cacti.
Right. Yep. So both of them go way back. We have archaeological evidence in both cases that goes back thousands of years. For the Huachuma, what's the most spectacular bit of evidence is in a ancient temple site called Chavin up in the Peruvian Andes, and that has that's an amazing place. It has kind of walls covered with stone heads of figures who are kind of shape-shifting from humans into jaguars, with fangs and claws, and often big gouts of like snot coming out of their noses, suggesting that, sort of DMT snuffs were probably part of the mix. And right in the center of this temple is a figure like this, just clutching, a big, really obvious Huachuma cactus. And that is, at least 3,000 years old. So we know that it goes back that far. With peyote, there are archaeological finds of dried peyotes in caves on the Texas-Mexico border by the Rio Grande, which go back at least that far, probably further. But we have kind of written evidence from the point when the Spanish arrived, so about 500 years ago. Quite a lot of Spanish explorers and conquistadors and doctors noticed that peyote was being used by indigenous people, and they were seeing visions. Of course, the Spanish had just come from Europe that was in the kind of grip of the witch craze. So all their early stuff about this is, the devil gets into the natives through this cactus and speaks to them and gives them visions. So you have to read through the Christian stuff a bit, but there are lots of varied descriptions of peyote being used from 500 years ago.
Okay, and do they know, like way back in the day? Let's start with Huachuma. Do they know what indigenous peoples or tribes were using these cacti?
Okay, it's that's an interesting question. I'm really fascinated, of course, like I'm sure you and your listeners are, by how they were using it. What were the ceremonies? How did all this work? Of course, that's exactly the kind of thing that you don't get out of archaeology. Right, right. You don't get the mindset. You don't get the ritual. But it was being. We found it. I mean, it grows up in the mountains, as I said, but it's been found on the coast. So it was traded, and it's the coast now is where the Huachuma, the curanderos mostly are. So it was probably trafficked. It was part of a kind of network of things, like coca would have been brought down from the mountains. And from very early on, there's kind of, fishing nets and cotton and all these things coming up from the coast. So we know it was part of that complex. The Chavin temple is very suggestive to me, anyway, in its architecture. It appears to have been a site of pilgrimage where people came for a particular ceremony. So there's no like evidence of like a lot of housing around there. There's no military fortifications. This is a kind of sacred spot, and it's got a big kind of plaza where you can imagine that people would have kind of group ceremonies in front of a pyramid. And in the pyramid are chambers and tunnels and all kinds of stuff, which looks like kind of private initiation ceremonies went on in there. So the architecture suggests to me that there were different aspects of this experience. One maybe was like a group ceremony. And it's quite possible that Huachuma was used in that context. It's very good for kind of getting everybody together. It's very empathic, of course, mescaline. So if you imagine people coming, to this ceremonial sacred center from all over, from the mountains, from the jungles, from the desert, this is, you can imagine that a kind of communal ceremony, where people would have drunk chicha, kind of fermented beer, and there's evidence that sometimes that had psychoactive components. So that's kind of, we're guessing, but that's kind of how I imagine it being used in that ancient context.
And are there any, before we go over to peyote, are there any indigenous tribes that are still using Huachuma as part of their practice today?
It's become something that's used by, in folk medicine, by curanderos, by people who specialize in it. And that's a ritual which presumably is kind of modern, but it obviously has very ancient elements. So if you you go particularly to the coastal cities of Peru, where I've been and seen it, then there's a witchcraft market, and people sell big chunks of Huachuma along with all kinds of other things, magical wands and perfumes. And the Huachuma ceremony, if you have one, you pay a curandero for a consultation, and that involves sitting around with what they call a mesa, a table of interesting kind of spiritually charged artifacts, bones and feathers and saints' effigies, and usually both parties taking a drink of the Huachuma, which puts you in this kind of sort of spiritually charged space where you can see things that are normally invisible, and you can see invisible forces, whether it might be, something that's put a curse on somebody, or whether it's a source of illness, or, where a lost object might be. And this is something that happens with tobacco and with incense and with Huachuma. So, that's kind of, that's the context in which it's used these days in individual divination and healing ceremonies.
Got it. So less of a proprietary to one lineage of people, but in the native region, they're using it in, like you said, a folk medicine way.
That's right, and for that reason, I think that was so long. It was so long to sort of attract attention of anthropologists, because anthropologists always search after the pristine traditions and all this kind of what they call syncretic stuff in the cities, which is all a bit mix and match. Is kind of seen as not so interesting. But that's kind of but that's in fact where our current ideas of the Huachuma ceremony come from.
Okay. And now, excuse me. And now let's talk a little bit about one that I know definitely has, I think, more of a defined lineage, and that's peyote.
Yep, absolutely. The Spanish, as I said, encountered peyote when they arrived in Mexico, and it was used by the Nahua people, the people they called Aztecs. Because of its association with devilry, it was prohibited by the Mexican Inquisition in 1620. It became the first drug to be prohibited by Europeans. But it carried on being used up in the north of Mexico, which was kind of more tribal and a bit more remote, and the Spanish never really got to grips with it. And even though it was banned, there are reports from the 17th, 18th century of villages where everybody would get together, usually round a fire, usually at night. Peyote would be passed around and people would sing and dance through the night. So we have a sense of that tradition. The Mexican tribal people who have famously maintained this, in a very traditional form, are the Huichol. The Huichol were in the used to live in the desert around Real de Catorce, but then when the Spanish came, they moved up into the more remote parts of the Sierra Madre. But they still make their annual pilgrimage down to Wirikuta, as they call it, their sacred land where the peyote grows, and it still grows there. And they've maintained their amazing tradition, their really rich spiritual culture with its sort of central symbols of the deer and the maize and the peyote. So whether that represents what everybody else was doing before the Spanish came along, who knows? Maybe it's something that's very particular to the Huichol. But yeah, we have a very good sense of that tradition. And then it's only much later, like in the late 19th century, that it comes to the Plains tribes in North America. And that happens during their period of forced captivity on the reservations. Before that, most Plains tribes had not encountered peyote because it only grows down on the Tex-Mex border. There were some Apache groups who knew about it and a few others, but it was really with the Texas railroads that it started to be transported up to the reservations in Oklahoma. So that whole tradition that became the Native American Church, that started in about 1870, 1880.
Interesting. Okay. And you brought up some things in there that I'd love to touch on, because we're going to come back to the current struggles of both the North American native tribes and the Wirikuta to protect the peyote. Yep. But you mentioned that this was the first prohibited drug in
That's right.
Mexico, correct? Can you talk a little bit about the legal status in wherever you would like to discuss? You're in England currently. We're here recording in the U.S., and I know we're talking a lot about Mexico, but whatever you could tell us about the legal landscape of both of these cacti and the mescaline within.
Sure. Mescaline is a Class A drug because mescaline was the first psychedelic to be discovered and investigated by science. Then it was joined by LSD, so it's kind of right in that very first generation of psychedelics. So from the 60s onwards, it was kind of banned and it's kind of Schedule 1 and no medical use. So, mescaline is kind of under heavy sort of legal strictures. Does that also apply to the cacti? There, things are a little bit different. I was a few years ago in Britain. I was expert witness in a series of court cases when people started buying dried Huachuma and importing it from Peru. And, they'd buy a bag of dried Huachuma and some zealous customs officer would seize it and check it out. And, then it got outrageously charged up. Like if it was a kilo bag, the charge would be importing 1 kilo of mescaline, a Class A drug, so somebody basically had to go along and be a witness and say, look, this is going to have like way less than 1% mescaline in. And apart from anything else, you can buy this cactus live legally in garden centers. That's an interesting thing about the Huachuma is that long before anybody knew that it had mescaline in, it was very widely used by cactologists and cactus growers as a rooting stock because it grows so fast, it's so easy to grow, you can graft all kinds of other cacti onto it. So, your average cactus supplier, or sort of sometimes even your cactus garden center will have Huachuma. So the legal status of the cactus is very kind of blurry, and in all the cases where I was a witness, the case against Huachuma got slung out before it even reached a jury. The judge would just say, what? So this is like the kind of cacti that my aunt keeps on her windowsill, So in some places in the world, the trade in Huachuma is controlled. In other places, it's pretty much legal. It's very easy to grow. Peyote is sort of more regularly criminalized because it's better known, but it's also, as we'll probably get onto, under extreme conservation pressures. So most of the sort of cactus material that's floating around the world, being grown, being transported, is Huachuma. And, I think for people interested in acquainting themselves with this, Huachuma is definitely, the ethical way to go in terms of mescaline cacti. It grows very fast. It grows everywhere. There's no conservation pressures on it.
I appreciate you adding that. I was going to ask, are the effects pretty similar between the two extractions of mescaline?
Peyote usually contains more mescaline, usually about the whole percentages thing gets very nerdy, but usually kind of, 2-3% of mescaline is quite common in peyote. And for that reason, peyote traditionally is eaten, either the dried button or it can be grated down into a powder. Huachuma, the concentration of mescaline is a bit less, usually more like 1%. And for that reason, Huachuma traditionally in South America is kind of brewed up into a tea that you drink. So you slice it up like you'd slice up a zucchini and you boil it up in water. And there's all kinds of other fancy things you can do after that to concentrate it. But basically, yeah, it's drunk and peyote is eaten.
Got it. And is there any entourage effect type thing that makes the experience of taking the mescaline from one cactus different from the other?
There certainly is an entourage effect. As I said, there's about 50 different alkaloids in the Huachuma and in the peyote, and different balances in different species. And I would say, some people make a lot out of the differences. To me, the real difference is the context in which you're doing this. You know, if you're doing it as a scientific experiment, it's going to be very different from taking it in a Native American church ceremony, and so I think my sense is that, it's more about, the intent and the context, whether it's experimental or ritual, and most particularly whether you're kind of on your own or doing it communally. I think there's something about the mescaline experience that, is very, very involving what goes on, everything that you get hit with, kind of visual effects, kind of auditory hallucinations, and all sorts of, often a lot of nausea. If you're taking it on your own, then you're very, very wrapped up in yourself. If you're taking it in a group context, there are ways, and I think the Native American Church does this brilliantly, there are ways of taking you out of yourself and making it a more communal experience. So I would say, rather than kind of getting into the weeds of the chemical entourage, I would focus more on the experience.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about so we talked about how you can get Huachuma in your garden center. It's a legal gray area. What about peyote? Because I live here in Austin, Texas. I think, South Texas, there's some peyote. What, I know the only equivalent I'm thinking of is cannabis, but cannabis generally has, there are different rules and regulations. Is there anything like that for peyote growth here where it just is naturally growing?
Right. The natural habitat of peyote is almost all in Mexico, but there's a little bit, as you probably know, kind of over on your side of the big river, around Laredo in that area, an area that's been known for a long time as the Peyote Gardens. And it was, way back in the 19th century, it was a place where different Native American tribes met, and there was a lot of exchange. And from the 19th century, there were people called peyoteros, who were families who lived there, and they'd pick peyote and dry it, and they'd sell it and trade it and exchange it. So that little bit of the Peyote Gardens is well known and well established. And I think, digging around for my book, I discovered that right in Austin, Texas, then like the 13th floor elevators when they're getting going, because most of those early psychedelic scenes, were, doing whatever they had to do, boiling up their morning glory seeds. But they figured out, hey, we can just go down to Laredo and pick some, so there's always been a bit of spillover. But what you've got now in the Peyote Gardens is a lot of pressure. Partly kind of the legal situation has changed. I believe this used to be administered by the state of Texas, and it's now all administered by the DEA. You've only got a certain number of licensed peyoteros, but also a lot of the land that used to be given over to peyote is now used for agriculture or for grazing. So there is less and less peyote in Texas, just at the point where, the Native American Church is thriving. It's bigger than ever before. It's kind of struggling to, deal with the demand there, let alone before you get all kinds of other interested people wanting to come down and wanting their piece of the shrinking peyote pie.
Yes, and that's a great segue into talking about the current struggles with the Huichol and the Wirikuta and the Native American tribes to hold on to this plant. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I was in Mexico earlier this year. I was lucky enough to do that while we could still move around. And pretty much everywhere, where there's a sort of street market and street stalls, there are people selling folk medicines, and there's lots and lots of them have a Huichol, maracame, or shaman on the bottle. Quite often there's peyote and marijuana tincture. Like, huh? What's that about? Wow. So who knows whether how much peyote is in these preparations? There's a project. There's a fantastic botanist at down in El Paso called Dr. Martin Terry. He's He's doing some work down there on analysing these and trying to find out what's going on. But for sure, the peyote is under pressure down in Wirikuta. Places where it used to grow, Huichol villages, you now have to, go off on a horse or kind of, walk for a couple of days to find it. When you harvest peyote, it's traditionally cut off at ground level. And if you do that, you interrupt the sort of enzyme channel, which stops it from growing. So if you cut it off like that, it then grows little babies, or pups as they're called. So if you keep harvesting your peyote that way, more will keep growing. But increasingly what's happening in Wirikuta is that the peyote is just being dug up by tractors. And so then it's not coming back. And of course, around Real de Catorce, there's a lot of people come, particularly for the annual Huichol pilgrimage. There's a big kind of peyote scene there, and it's definitely a lot scarcer than it was there.
Yeah, I was going to say, you brought up the tractors. That's because I saw this documentary, like a lot of mining is coming into the area. Is that correct?
That's right. The Wirikuta, the sacred land of the Huichol, also happens to be kind of, full of, I think, sort of bauxite, aluminium. Anyway, it's being mined by a Canadian company now. So large tracts of Huichol sacred land have been bought up and mined, and they've had a campaign going for a while, raising money and buying chunks of it back and getting kind of stays on the sort of industrial and mining uses. So there's kind of a big land struggle going on, and the Huichol have maintained their traditional lifeway, including this, long pilgrimage through land that was open desert, but is now increasingly fenced off. So yeah, that's a big struggle that's going on, and they've done amazingly well to draw attention to it and to get kind of, sort of global interest in it. They are, their art is so spectacular. Their culture is so vibrant and so beautiful. There's such amazing advertisements for that kind of tribal lifeways, and I think there are a lot of people behind them now.
Yes, I'm definitely going to put a link in the show notes to that documentary that I watched. I'm drawing a blank on the name, but it covered that struggle and the mining coming in, and then all of they had essentially like a giant concert in Mexico City to raise awareness, and
yeah,
I would love for people to check out that fight, because you said like it's this not necessarily a small tribe, but it is a singular tribe that is really doing a great job at getting the world to understand their plight, and so I hope that they are successful in preserving some of this important medicine. I would love to hear from you before we finish. You are just an encyclopedia of knowledge, and this has been so much fun. What are some of your reasons that you specifically investigated this plant? What drew you to this?
Well, it's for a long time I've been there's an incredibly rich literature of people writing about their mescaline experiences. Some of it within anthropology, some of it within kind of pharmacy and laboratory science and medicine, but also artists, a lot of modernist artists and surrealist artists, because it was around then. So what really interested me was that we kind of go, oh, psychedelics, that story started in the 60s or the 50s. If you look at mescaline, it's like, no, I mean, the Western stories started way back in the 19th century, and there are all these kind of stories, all these strange worlds. I mean, who knew? I didn't know, for example, that there was a branch of the, Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, who in the 1920s thought about using peyote as their sacrament, for example. Of course, it was being used by, figures in ritual magic like Aleister Crowley, way back in the day. As I said, there were lots of experiments by artists working with it. So it opens up all this completely forgotten psychedelic history that goes way back before we thought the story of psychedelics started. And also it's got these really rich indigenous traditions. So you can kind of tell two stories at once. Okay, this is the story of kind of what mescaline is for us and how we isolated and synthesized it and used it. But here's another story of a completely different way of using these plants and understanding the experience and integrating it into your culture. So I really wanted to tell those two stories side by side.
Oh, that's beautiful. Two last things. One, you can't leave us hanging. Please tell us about the Mormon Church and their their consideration of the use of mescaline in their ceremonies.
Okay, well, this was the grandson of Joseph Smith, the founder, Frederick Smith, and he was back in the sort of 1910s. He was a kind of somebody who wanted to modernize the church, and he was and to bring it into tune with kind of modern life. And he read his people like William James, and the sort of psychologists, and he studied, ecstatic religious experience in other cultures, and he felt this is what's missing. When you go to church, you should have a genuine ecstatic religious experience. It shouldn't just be this procession. So how can we do that? How can we bring that into our church? And the Mormons have always proselytized to Native Americans, in Utah, and where Fred Smith was, also in Missouri. It's always been important for them. And he went and he attended peyote ceremonies, and he loved them. And he spoke up for the Native American church, at federal and kind of government hearings, and he became a great champion of it.
Wow, interesting. And one last thing I wanted to cover, because there's so much talk today about, there's this influx of companies into the psychedelic space, and there are a lot of them that are focused on making synthetic versions of these medicines, especially the ones that are more, either harder to find or endangered in some way or the other. What, if anything, could you tell us about synthetic mescaline and how it's been used?
It's well, as we said, it was first isolated way back in 1897. It was first synthesized in the laboratory exactly 100 years ago in 1919, 1920. It was used very widely in medical science. Of course, in psychiatry, people thought, in the 50s, there was this big thing that it might be kind of might tell us about the chemical cause of schizophrenia. That was how Aldous Huxley came across it, and he wrote his Doors of Perception. But then it pretty much disappeared in the 60s, really because, it's because of dosage. Compared to LSD, you have to take a huge dose. So a gram of mescaline is 3 doses. A gram of LSD is 30,000 doses or whatever it is. So, of course, that took over. And, once the sort of psychedelic culture got going, then that was then that was the same way that it went with with the underground chemists. Why bother to make a gram of mescaline when you could make a gram of acid, right? So it kind of disappeared. But the really interesting figure in this story, I think, is Alexander Shulgin, because he started with mescaline. That was his first trip in the 60s. And he started looking around for analogs and synthetics, and that was what set him on his path. And he discovered, of course, MDMA, as we know, and 2CB and all the 2C drugs and all these new phenethylamines. So these are all kind of synthetic versions of mescaline in a way. So I think in a way what Sasha Shulgin did was he kind of designed mescaline out, because mescaline, it takes, it lasts, it's a long lasting, longer than acid, just 12 hours, it can be quite heavy physically, Shulgin came up with these versions that kind of gave you a bit of the same buzz, but it was like 3 or 4 hours and much more user friendly. So in a way, kind of, that whole world of dance drugs and MDMA psychotherapy, I see that all as kind of, those are all the stepchildren of mescaline, if you like.
Gotcha. I like that description. Mike, I could just sit and listen to you talk about this forever. I want to come to England. Mike is in England. He's got this fireplace behind him and it looks very warm. And I just want to come for Mike's fireside chats, because this is yours. This is no question. You do not have a fantastic, long, interesting story too. So thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell people about your book and where they can find it?
Yeah, I will do. It's called Mescaline, A Global History of the First Psychedelic. You can find it, I guess, everywhere. It's Yale University Press have published it. It's a hardback. It's also an audio book, so you can find it that way. It'll be a paperback next year, I guess. And the other thing that I'd like to mention, I'll send you the link, is that there's a project going on at the moment with Martin Terry, I mentioned, who has a license to cultivate peyote. He's starting to get that together with a Comanche group in Oklahoma, trying to develop peyote cultivation within the sort of within the world of the Comanche people, and that's really the big problem with peyote conservation, is you're not allowed to cultivate it. If we could find a way of cultivating it, that would ease the pressure for everybody. So I think that's a really good initiative, and I shall send you a link for if anybody wants to support that.
I appreciate that. We will put that in the notes as well. Thank you again so much for joining us today, Mike.
Oh, that was a pleasure, Anna Marie.
All right, for everybody else out there, until next time.